What makes you a great problem solver? Is it something in your genes or a skill that you've learned? When Einstein was 5 years old and ill in bed, his father brought him a gift, a magnetic compass. The 5-year-old Einstein was fascinated because whichever way he held the compass, it always pointed in the same direction. It was a momentous gift. Einstein remarked years later that it was the magnetic compass that made him wonder that there must be an invisible force behind everything in the universe. And as we know, he dedicated his life to finding it. Nearly a century later, I was a banker living in New York, and one day I saw a film on PBS, Public Broadcasting Station, TV, on the life of the mathematical genius Ramanujan. The film was titled The Man Who Loved Numbers. A few weeks later, I visited what was then called Madras in South India and called on Mrs. Ramanujan, who was then in her 90s. She led me to a very modest living room that was dominated by a magnificent bust of Ramanujan's, done by a sculptor, an American sculptor. And she spoke about him with tears in her eyes as if he'd just passed away a few days ago. He had passed away about 70 years earlier. And she said, you know, for him it was just numbers, numbers, and numbers. He didn't just love numbers, he lived them. So I know what you're thinking. Do I have to be Ramanujan or Einstein to be creative? So let's fast forward to 2008. On a hot summer's day in rural India, southern India to be more precise, two village girls, Rani and Roja, sat under a tree to escape from the sun, a very sensible thing to do in the Indian summer. And Rani looked at Roja and said, you know, Roja, I wonder, why do you feel cool or cooler sitting in the shade of a tree? And Roja thought for a second and said, well, it must have something to do with the fact that the leaves and branches of the tree shield us from the hot rays of the sun. And they talked a little bit more about it, and then the aha question popped out. Would different leaves have different cooling effects? And that question led to a project titled, not surprisingly, The Cooling Effect of Leaves. And working with instructors from the Agastya Foundation 9 months later, they won a prestigious National Science Award, the Intel Iris National Science Award, competing with the best and brightest kids from across India, mostly urban students. So what do these stories tell you? I think they tell you the value of curiosity, of the spirit of inquiry, the magic of wonder, the power of passion. The mission of the foundation that I head, Agastya Foundation, is to spark curiosity and creativity in economically disadvantaged children and rural teachers across India. And we're doing this working with people like you, representing governments, social investors, obviously children, teachers, business people, touching over 1 million children a year in ways that we believe they haven't been touched before, through mobile science labs, satellite science centers, and a campus that we call our Creativity Lab, located 2 hours by road from Bangalore. Cognitive scientists tell us that the average human brain retains in its long-term memory no more than 5% of a lecture, maybe 10% of what you read, 50% of what you see and hear, 70% of what you discuss with someone, 80% of what you personally experience, good or bad, we can all relate to that, and over 90% of what you teach to others. So what Agastya is focusing on is hands-on experiential learning, methods of learning that spark curiosity, that create new experiences, unforgettable experiences, to improve retention and to make learning fun, useful, and of course accessible. When you're dealing with millions of children, as all of us do in India, access becomes very important. So how did we get here? When I was a student at Rishi Valley, a boarding school in South India founded by the great philosopher J. Krishnamurti, I read a book about a mythical Himalayan kingdom, Shangri-La. And I had a dream of living in Shangri-La. And over the years, my dream of living in Shangri-La matured into a desire to build a school for creative leaders in the Himalayas. Leaders who would come out and transform India. You know that famous Hermann Hesse book, Magister Ludi. So I went and studied economics and then went for a business degree in London, where I read another book, this time on the life of Che Guevara. Mind you, it wasn't part of recommended course reading at the London Business School. But it affected me in some ways. So I came back to India and joined a multinational US bank and spent the next 20 years trying to be a financial mover and shaker, a status not so complimentary in today's context. And in the process, I reconnected with an old friend in London, a very extraordinary individual, a very spiritual person. We'd go for long walks in Regent's Park and Kensington Gardens and talk not about business, but about the meaning of life. And he was very incisive, very high bandwidth kind of person. And he said, Ramji, this is not you. This is not your karma. You're leading a very selfish life, a very one-dimensional life, making money from money. You really need to reach out to society at large, because that's the only way you'll grow, and be vulnerable. Don't try and create this fortress of protection around yourself, as you seem to have done all these years throughout your career. And that was about the time I was thinking again about this old project of mine, building the school. I remember taking the underground one day to work in London and remembering the old Pink Floyd song, The Dark Side of the Moon. Hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way. And I was thinking, oh my God, have I become one of those characters that Pink Floyd sang about? And I said, look, I really don't know what I should be doing, but this is not it. And perhaps my friend Gopi is right. I have become desperate. So that was the incentive, to answer your question, in a simplistic way, to get out and try something different. Now, this was 1998, when India stunned the world by exploding 5 nuclear devices. My father was visiting me in London, and he said, look, Ramji, neither of us is an educator. We haven't built schools. We're not scientists. So I think if you want this project to take off, we've got to consult people with the right sorts of backgrounds. So let's go and talk to Dr. P.K. Iyengar. Iyengar used to be the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. So I went back to India and got a group of people together, P.K. Iyengar, the former principal of Rishi Valley School, a lot of children, college students, school students, and we asked a lot of interesting questions, just free-form brainstorming. One of them was, look, Rishi Valley was founded by a spiritual genius, J. Krishnamurti. And Krishnamurti would often ask the principal the question, has the school produced outstanding people? And if not, why is that the case? His definition of outstanding obviously was different from the traditional definition of success. It was about people who were willing to go off the beaten track, really examine their lives, do things differently, and all the rest of it. And we concluded that perhaps the reason it hadn't happened, at least with the intensity and scale that the founder had envisioned and envisaged, was because the teachers, you had this great man up there and the children in the classroom, and he didn't have enough translators. People who could take some of his ideas and say, look, he's saying something very different. Should we reflect on it? Is there any way of applying it to teaching physics or math or chemistry or whatever? Right? So that was one idea we felt, that teachers had to reform and transform. Iyengar came at it very differently. He said, look, this is the way we built the scientific and technological infrastructure of India. And he was one of the fathers of the Indian atom bomb, good or bad. And this is how we did it. But at every stage, we found we were scraping the barrel in terms of finding people who could think out of the box. So we created an institute to promote the scientific temper in rural India, but it just hasn't happened. Cause-effect thinking is absent, for the most part, in the Indian education system. And that's the reason why we're not able to deal with and solve a lot of our problems. So your idea of working with teachers, of sparking creativity and curiosity, if we could find a way of multiplying that through rural India, then I think we'll create transformation. So a spiritual perspective, Krishnamurti used to talk about transformation of the psyche through curiosity and by thinking without bias, by looking at a situation as it is, as opposed to what it should be. Iyengar was talking about the same thing, but in a scientific way. So we said, all right, let's develop a model for this, and we came up with a sort of model. We interviewed a lot of children, and you'd hear comments like this college student who said, I can't remember a single thing that I learned at school. Most of us can relate to that. Many of us can. And the only thing I remember is the project I did of building an African village. Or somebody else would talk about some hiking expedition. And by and large, what we found all these examples had in common was there was an experiential thing to it. It wasn't Ramanujan writing mathematical equations, sitting in a room, but it was about going out and getting physically, mentally absorbed, involved in something, as opposed to just listening passively to people speaking. So we said, look, the education system clearly is somewhat lopsided, focused on the I talk, you listen model. And lots of people are doing good work in terms of literacy, in terms of reading, and all the rest of it. The government has certainly created a huge infrastructure. And when I interview people today, we can all be critical. They tell me that 30 years ago, there was no access to a school. You had to walk 10 kilometers. And today they have access through bicycles or buses, and more people are going to school and all the rest of it. So a lot of good work's been done over the last 40, 50 years, but a lot more needs to be done. And then we ask questions like, what makes a person creative? Is it possible to raise the speed limit of creativity in a society, in a country? How would one even go about doing that? Is it a contradiction in terms? And as I said, we came up with a model. We said, look, creative people, good problem solvers, tend to be outstanding observers. They just don't see something, they actually observe something more than the average person does. Why? There's a whole literature on that. They tend to be more aware. They have the capacity to integrate, assimilate information in very creative ways, to associate different strands of information. And they're brilliant at applying it, right? But all of this is based on curiosity. If you're not curious, then you're not going to observe. The desire to want to observe has to exist before you can observe, at least subconsciously, if not consciously. So we said, let our mission be to spark curiosity, and we were all thrilled. This was all new to me, being a banker, being curious and creative. It's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? But anyway, we went with this model, met the government of Andhra Pradesh. The chief minister at the time was very receptive to new ideas, and he said, never heard of anything like this, so I give you my blessings, go for it. The first thing we did was to buy a piece of land, barren land, 2 hours by road from Bangalore, rocky wasteland actually, and we said we're going to anchor our institution on this campus. There wasn't a blade of grass then, but it had beautiful and has beautiful views. And that was the good news. The bad news was I was funding all this myself in the early years, and very quickly we ran out of money. And yeah, I'd made a trade-off and sacrifice and all the rest of it, but I wasn't prepared to see my net worth go down to zero in such a rapid pace of time. So I said, I've got to find other people to help. And that was 2000. The world had gone through the dot-com bust, so a lot of rich Indians living abroad, were sort of backing off. Their share values had collapsed. So we began to think. And somebody said, look, while we wait for money to build the buildings to attract children and teachers to our campus, let's take education out to the villages. So how do we do that? How about a mobile science lab? So it sounds excellent. A friend of mine in an auto company loaned us a second-hand vehicle. Dr. Iyengar arranged for an institute in Mumbai to gift us a trunk full of low-cost science experiments, ingenious stuff made of coat hangers and pieces of string and discarded plastic bottles, candles and stuff like that. And we trained Balram, our campus tractor driver, to be our first mobile lab instructor. I guess he had no option, either do that or look for something else. He was not even a Bachelor of Science, he was a Bachelor of Arts. But the trainers from Mumbai said, he's quite smart, he can handle it. And we set him loose in the villages. A few weeks went by and I asked Balram, how's it going, Balram? And he said, excellent, they love it. The children absolutely are thrilled. It's engaging, it's interesting. At first they would run away thinking I was a missionary. But then when I pulled this box out and showed them all these exciting things, they came flocking back. So I said, great, Balram, continue doing this till we come up with a better idea or more money. Now, the mobile lab became the vehicle for another initiative at scale, the Village Science Fair. And I remember this particular science fair in a village in Karnataka. We'd planned for about 500 children to come to the fair. So we had trained about 10 teachers, government teachers, to teach the experiments to the visiting children. When, to our horror, we were told to expect 5,000 children. Now, that might seem a lot to you out here in Helsinki, but in India, it's not even a drop in an ocean. But it seemed a huge number to us at that time with 10 teachers. How do you handle 5,000 kids? So we huddled again. This time, we were rescued by a bunch of young girls like Gina, who came up to us and said, look, you seem to be in a bit of a spot. You don't have enough teachers, right? Right. If you train us to teach these experiments, maybe we can solve your problem. It seemed like a terrible idea, but we had no option. So we worked at it furiously, trained them over a day or two, I can't remember, and kept our fingers crossed. The fair was a huge success, not least because the visiting children saw not gray-haired men like me with forbidding expressions standing behind tables waiting to teach them science, but other children, albeit a little older than them, with big smiles on their face, dying to express themselves. And this led to what we call the Young Instructor Leader Program, one of our most transformative programs, a program that we're trying to scale up, a program that the National Knowledge Commission in India came and saw and recommended that it should be, scaled up across India. So the Young Instructor Leader Program was born out of this. Both these battlefield innovations make me appreciate the old saying that abundance often makes you poor. And we all know the old saying, necessity being the mother of invention. And clearly, these were examples where we had no option, backs to the wall, and then something interesting came out of it. And they've become the basis for creating a hands-on science education ecosystem. The government of Karnataka, the state where I live, responsible for the education of over 10 million kids, has adopted the model and said, look, let's have an ecosystem consisting of your mobile labs, mini science centers, larger science centers, and an apex campus, rather like the campus that we've built in Kuppam, our creativity lab. And right at the bottom, now a lab in a box. So we're working with the government to set up this hands-on ecosystem for science. But what are the behaviors that this ecosystem ought to encourage? Are you teaching science, or are you sparking curiosity? Or are you doing both? And is science the only means to sparking curiosity and creativity? Obviously not. But that's where we'd built up a critical mass of expertise. So I thought deeply about it, read a lot of books on how people influence change, and there seemed to be a common sort of theme, and that was